Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. We haven't done a list in a little while, I think, and it's time to do a new one. I particularly like to do these at the end of the year when we can talk about all kinds of just fun topics and, sort of have a chat for the end of this particular season. Since we're now pushing the middle of December, this list is 10 historical performances I wish I'd attended. I know you must have some too, so I'm very interested to get your opinion where you would have wanted to be a fly on the wall. You know what I mean? You really wanted to be there to see what happened, to hear what happened for yourself. So here are 10 of mine. And, when you read like booklet notes in the history of various pieces, you often read about the circumstances of the premieres or famous performances or moments. And, you got to be curious. You just have to be, right? So here they are. Number 1, the premiere of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Sixth, and the Choral Fantasy, and the Fourth Piano Concerto, and just about everything else he wrote between 1805 and 1810, somewhere in there. This was a famous disaster of a concert. The hall had no heat. It was the middle of December. It was like just before Christmas or just after. It was freezing. It was the holiday season. Nobody showed up. Beethoven lost a fortune. The orchestra broke down. The soprano had a nervous breakdown before she could sing A Perfido, the concert aria. I mean, it was just a disaster. Just a horrible mess. I really want to know just how horrible the mess was. It must have been quite something. I mean, and very depressing for Beethoven, but fascinating for the rest of us historically. I mean, the story has survived. It's as famous as the symphony itself. It's part of the mythology that surrounds Beethoven's Fifth and Sixth Symphonies. In those days, the numbers were reversed. The pastoral was the fifth, and the fifth was the sixth. I mean, oh my goodness, what fun it must have been. In a sort of depressing kind of way. So that's my number 1. Number 2, the premiere of Monteverdi's Orfeo. Now, Orfeo was written sometime, it was around 1605, something like that. I'm being very fast and loose with dates because, frankly, I don't care. It's the event that matters. But Monteverdi has come down in history as the first opera that has come down to us in something like its original form, because it was written for a royal wedding in Mantua. One of the Gonzagas was getting married, and so Monteverdi made a presentation copy of the score, which tells us who played what. And we don't know what the answer to that question for like the next 60 years. Composers didn't bother to actually orchestrate things. They just wrote short scores, and theaters did it however they wanted to do it. Anyway, we know what played in Monteverdi's Orfeo, and it is the first full-fledged opera. And I wanted to be there. Damn it. I really did. I mean, yeah, it was a royal wedding. I guess you'd need an invitation. I couldn't just walk in or buy a ticket. But often for these royal occasions, they did sell tickets, or they did, open them up to the public after, of course, the private presentations for the royal family and their guests. I don't know exactly what the circumstances were or how many performances were given. All I know is that wouldn't you really want to see the first ever acknowledged opera? Now, I know you're going to tell me that, the first opera was Jacopo Peri's Euridice or Eurydice, whatever it was called, the earlier one, slightly earlier by a few years. But we don't have that in the same form that we have Orfeo. And so I am very, very content to say that this is the first serious opera. And believe it or not, it's still in the repertoire. And that's just as amazing, isn't it? I mean, it has existed since 1600-something, and it's now 2000-something, 2022. And for the past 417 or 18 or 19 years, we've been hearing Orfeo by Monteverdi because this score exists. Or we could have heard it. I mean, it disappeared for a few hundred years in the middle there, but who's counting? Yeah, I wanted to be there. Number 3, Stravinsky, the premiere of the Rite of Spring, the famous riot. I mean, if it was in France, it was a riot, because that's what the French audiences do. They riot. We have another one coming up. But the Rite of Spring was a famous riot because you had, these technically, ballerinas who are like, dressed in burlap with hairy armpits like this, going, it didn't really go over very well from a costume and wardrobe point of view. Never mind the music, which apparently nobody could hear because they were all screaming so loudly. And Pierre Monte just sat there unflappably, conducting as he always did. And Stravinsky escaped out a stage door and ducked and covered and somehow got back to his hotel intact. Actually, after the premiere, it was played as a concert work, and it was a huge success. It was a huge success because, of course, it had been a scandal the first time, and everybody wanted to go see the scandal, and they loved it. It was scandalous. Just a terrific piece, but it did tell us something because the work has never been successful as a ballet. Nobody really wants to see a bunch of Neanderthals jumping up and down on stage when you can have a major orchestra, not a pit ensemble, play the living daylights out of possibly the most thrilling music that had ever been written up to that point in terms of rhythm and volume and conceptual daring. So yes, I wish I had been there. I really wanted to be there. So that's number 3. Number 4. Oh yeah. This one really interests me. The Haydn String Quartet in F minor, Opus 20, number 5. Now, this is one of the great early classical quartets. It's that series, the Opus 20 quartets, that established really the classical language, and it's one of Haydn's Sturm und Drang, expressively intense quartets. And one day in 1776, he and a bunch of his buddies went over to Gluck's house, and they had a little quartet soiree, and this is what they played. And I wanted to be there. God, to talk to Haydn, to talk to Gluck, to see how Gluck loved it, by the way. He thought it was marvelous. They had a great time. Haydn was friendly with it. We tend to forget just what a tiny world, the world of the arts, the world was back in those days, because society was so stratified. There was a tiny group of aristocrats. They were all related by marriage and whatnot. They all knew each other. There was a tiny group of, there was no real middle class. There was a tiny group of artists and people who we care about. And in a city like Vienna, which maybe had 100,000 people in it, that was a big city, remember? So they all knew each other. And then there was everybody else, peasants, workers, servants, people. They didn't matter. Historically, they didn't matter. And so, Haydn knew Gluck, Haydn knew Boccherini, Haydn grew up in the same house, actually, that Gluck lived in. And also in that house was the poet Metastasio, who wrote all the libretti for all of the Baroque operas that ever existed. And his teacher, Popora, who was one of those Baroque composers, who trained Haydn, and Haydn lived in the upper floor, and Gluck lived the floor, downstairs, and Popora lived a little more downstairs. They were 4-story walk-ups with an attic, and they were all together. And we don't really pay any attention to that, to this idea, this access that they all had to one another. I mean, Haydn got in trouble for climbing on the facade of Schönbrunn Palace, and Empress Maria Theresa, had him and his friends. They were a bunch of little boys running around, had them whipped, and 20 years later, she went to hear Haydn's operas, and Haydn performed with the orchestra at Esterhazy, and she said, "See, that whipping produced something." The type of accessibility that people had was something we don't remember. So that's one quartet party I wanted to be. I wanted to be at the Haydn Opus 20, number 5, at Gluck's house. Oh, that must have been so much fun. Next, Wagner, back to Paris, the Jockey Club riot in 1861. Wagner revised Tannhäuser by request for a Paris premiere, the Paris Opera. And there were a lot of people who came to the opera just to see the ballet, supposedly, which had to be in the second act. Had to be, because the Jockey Club people, who were dating all the ballerinas, or sleeping with them, in any case, and sponsoring them and giving them money, and, were not, they wouldn't show up until the second act because they were at dinner or doing whatever they were doing, and they'd come for the ballet and they would leave. Well, there was no place to stick a ballet in Tannhäuser except right at the beginning in Act 1, which is where Wagner put it. So when people showed up for Act 2, the Jockey Club, they were very, very annoyed. And apparently, I mean, the mythology is that there was a riot. In real life, apparently, there was a lot of booing and hissing. And then it got worse at subsequent performances. The real issue seems to have been that Wagner, cheap son of a bitch that he was unwilling to pay the claque. Now, the claque is a wonderful institution. The claque was most active at the Paris Opera for the longest period of time, but they existed in all the major opera houses. These were the people who bought the cheap seats, or you gave them money to buy the cheap seats, and their job was to applaud wildly the singer in favor, and to boo hysterically at the one out of favor, and throw rotten vegetables and do all kinds of disgusting things. That was the claque. Now, there was a guy who would be the head claqueur, and you would pay him, and he would pay off his coterie of individuals who would show up at the opera for this purpose. And everyone paid off the claque. Everybody was in on the game. That was just the way it worked. And Wagner apparently was not going to pay the claque. At least perhaps that was the problem. And so the claque got its revenge, along with the Jockey Club and everybody else. I mean, it didn't take very much for Wagner to make himself hated by everyone he encountered. So, whatever happened, of course. But it was a wonderful, nasty event, and I wanted to see it, probably more than I would want to see Tannhäuser, which I can't stand. So, we'll leave that one right where it is. After that, we'll jump back a few years. Handel, the premiere of the Royal Fireworks music. Oh my goodness, that must have been fun, because the whole platform caught fire and burned down, and somebody got killed, I think. I think there was only one death, or someone got seriously burned or emaciated, and then, oh, what a mess that was. But you have this enormous wind orchestra. Really, the fireworks music uses the largest wind orchestra that anybody ever used up until modern time. It's like 24 oboes and 12 bassoons and 9 trumpets and 9 horns and 3 sets of double timpani and all kinds of crazy stuff. It's just thrilling, only except that it sort of blew up. It exploded. It was, 1748? It was written to commemorate the peace of Aix-la-Chapelle or something like that. It was somewhere around there. Oh my goodness, what a disaster that must have been. But at least it was outside. So when the explosion happened and the fire, caught, you could escape. I mean, you could run away. But again, this is another one of those things. Could you imagine something like that today? I mean, could you possibly imagine? I mean, there's the king, and everyone's just hanging out with the king. I mean, presumably he had some security. But, he just was out there. The thing is blowing up, and they're listening to the music, and it must have been quite a day. I wish I'd been there. So number 7. What's number 7? Oh, Liszt. Anything. I just want to see one of Liszt's piano recitals. Liszt invented the piano recital. Because back in the day, there was no such thing as a piano recital. There was no thing that featured a pianist, just a pianist playing piano music. In those days, when you gave a concert, it was a potpourri event. You had to have a soprano, you'd have a violinist, or you did something like that. The piano would accompany things. He would call out to the audience and say, "Give me a tune, I'll play an improvisation." They would do all kinds of stuff because people needed to be entertained. The idea that you would play long works like a Beethoven sonata, those were written to be played at home. They weren't played in public. You wouldn't sit through a lengthy 20, 30-minute 4-movement piano sonata. God forbid! Your patience should be taxed. No, you'd have to have a couple arias and a song and a something, and you'd get up and you'd yawn and stretch and have some snacks, But Liszt really invented the piano recital, where there was just him, his piano, and a serious program of music. Not that he was opposed to calling out for a tune and improvising something once. I mean, he would play the game a bit. But you remember, people would, he would come out, he had all these long, bony hands, and he'd wear these long silk gloves, and he'd toss them into the audience, and the women would catch them and pass out and have an orgasm. And I really wanted to be there. I don't care which one. I don't care what he played. I just want to hear the man play and take in the ambiance of this mystical being. Of course, people said the same thing about Paganini. It was Paganini who influenced Liszt, to develop his transcendental technique and all of that stuff. But solo violinists didn't exist. They were still stuck in the rut. You had to have an accompanist, a pianist. Usually you had to have a soprano. No one would just listen to a violin. They still don't want to listen to a violin, frankly, most of the time. I mean, we live in very perverse times where it's okay for like a violinist to get out on stage and play like all the Bach sonatas and partitas in one show. I think people have to be insane to put up with things like that. I think the old system was really better. But that old system persisted well into the 20th century. If you read, for example, what's his name? Joseph Szigeti, his biography. He talks about how violin recitals just didn't exist when he was growing up. The idea that you would play a big violin sonata, a serious program of chamber music in public, it wasn't done. You played sniglets. You played little short pieces with as much variety as possible. And that's what the record labels do now. You noticed? I mean, we've returned to that because what are the major labels doing? They find some hotsy-totsy, instrumental virtuoso, and they do a program of little teeny bitlets. They don't do big serious programs as often as not. I mean, yeah, they have to do the Goldberg variations, but aside from that, they do little short, a buffet, a smorgasbord of shorter pieces. And that's one of those currents that has flown through our concert life, and Liszt really upended it. And I want to see him upend. So there you go. And I don't care what it was. Like I said, I just go anywhere, anytime, any place. He's going to give a recital. It was only a few years when he did. And then he quit. He retired to Weimar. So it was a limited opportunity. After that, let's see, number 8, Gershwin, the premiere of the Rhapsody in Blue. That was in 1924. And remember, it was at the Paul Whiteman Jazz Band did something called an experiment in modern music. And that concert, that original concert, has been recreated. It's been recreated on disc. But it's not the same thing. Not the same thing as being there, seeing Gershwin himself play it from memory, because he really hadn't written it down, and Grafé conducting, or Paul Whiteman conducted, but Grafé orchestrated it, of course. And now that jazz band original scoring of the work is quite well known, and it's been recorded many, many times. But in 1924, it was all fresh, and it was all new, and it was one of the first fusion concerts, a mixture of classical music and jazz. It must have been so exciting, so fresh and so marvelously, wonderfully captivating, and really a huge clash of cultures. Because, the classical people were as snotty and obnoxious as they are today, maybe even a little bit more so. They were just as horrible and intolerant, and so the idea of mixing jazz and classical music in this sense, and bringing saxophones into the orchestra, it was a big deal. If you ever want to hear really how just ridiculous they were about these things, the classical people, listen to Bruno Walter talk about jazz. Bruno Walter talking about jazz, it is absolutely, prelapsarian to hear him do this. He talks about wailing saxophones as though it is the end of civilization as we know it. It's really, really kind of fascinating, because there was a guy who was completely imbued and obsessed with the Western European musical culture of the classics, and they did not have wailing saxophones. And it was a big deal. Just the fact that they existed was a big deal. And that's why I wanted to go hear Rhapsody in Blue. It was the start of a process that really went very far in trying to break down some of those barriers, those that the snot brigade is doing their best to to prop up even today. So after that, number 9, Mahler, the premiere of the 8th Symphony. The one great triumph in Mahler's life was the premiere of his Eighth Symphony in Munich. And there's a picture of Mahler standing there with the entire performing forces. I mean, they had to build, it was like, they do that in Munich. They build buildings for concerts. There was Bayreuth, there was this whole exhibition pavilion that was built just for this purpose with an organ. And there's like half the population of Bavaria is performing in this thing. They're either singing or playing. There's Mahler, he's a little tiny figure. And there's just this unbelievable quantity of people everywhere. And it was supposed to have been one hell of a concert, let me tell you. I mean, first of all, everybody in Europe was there. Apparently, it was the hottest ticket in Europe. And the list of great musicians who just had to be there to attend it has been growing ever since the premiere. They keep adding names to people who were theoretically there, even though they really weren't. But, that's how important it was. You define importance by famous people who showed up. And so everybody was there, who was anybody. And, Alma, of course, was transfixed. She wrote about it in her biography. He turned that music into fountains of light and stuff and whatnot. Oh, she was the biggest bullshit artist that ever wrote an autobiography. Anyway, it must have been quite an event. And to hear Mahler conduct his own work, and that work, one of the toughest of all the Mahler symphonies to really bring off, I would have given anything to hear how he did it and to know, how he set the tempi and how he balanced it and what he did. And, oh my goodness, it's just, what a pity. That was around what, 1908, something like that. 1908, 1909, somewhere in there. 1910, I don't know, towards the end of his life. And oh, what a night it must have been. Damn it, I missed it. Okay, last but not least, this is a chamber music soiree that I have spoken of many times, but oh, I wish I had been there. The Mozart string quintets with Haydn and Mozart playing the two viola parts. Because when Haydn was in Vienna, he was in Esterházy, in the swamp in Hungary during the off season, but then he came back to Vienna. And if Mozart was in town, they would get together and they hung out a lot, as much as they possibly could. We really don't know the extent of their interaction, but they were very, very dear friends, of course. And it was at a quartet soiree that, Haydn heard the Mozart quartets dedicated to him, where he told Mozart's father that Mozart was the greatest composer known to him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the concert I wanted to hear, the domestic event, were those Mozart string quintets, because those are, first of all, his greatest chamber works, bar none. And to have Haydn and Mozart both playing the viola parts in performances of those quintets must have been, oh my goodness, I just hope they had snacks. You got to have snacks at these things. I mean, good snacks. Haydn wrote about them occasionally. I mean, there's a wonderful letter where he asks his Maria von Genzinger, one of those women, and he's like, when you're back, he was in Esterházy. He's like, the food here sucks. Do me a favor. Get me a couple pounds of good Parmesan cheese. That's a good snack. So we know that food was important as well. But beyond the food, it was to have Haydn and Mozart playing the viola parts and the Mozart string quintets. I mean, wow! It doesn't get better than that, does it? At least I don't think it does. So those are my 10, and I'm very interested to know what yours are too. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.